Look at this dark skin sitting here trying to look important. Let me save us both some time, sweetheart. A high-end firm like ours doesn't do walk-ins for people like you.
Preston Ashford sneered, letting out a dry, condescending laugh that echoed across the marble lobby. He snatched the company brochure off the front desk and practically slammed it onto the lap of the quiet black woman sitting by the door.
Go try the community branch 2 blocks south. Our investment minimums are out of reach for your kind, and frankly, you're just ruining the view for our actual wealthy clients.
The lobby went dead silent. A junior analyst froze halfway through a sentence on the phone. Nobody defended her. They all looked at her dark skin and decided she was a lost, broke nobody who did not belong inside a 100-year-old institution. But she did not flinch. And she did not raise her voice. She simply stared at him with an unbearable, cold calm. The kind of calm that comes from a person who is no longer reacting to you, only filing you away. Because what this arrogant managing partner did not know was that this exact black woman was Adewora Sterling, the legendary founder of Meridian Sovereign Capital. She was the absolute owner of the $4 billion fund that his dying firm had spent the better part of a year begging to manage. And in exactly 90 minutes, this entire building would be brought to its knees. Her name was Adewora Sterling, though almost everyone who worked for her called her Ada, because she had never once in her life needed a longer name to be taken seriously by anyone who actually mattered. And at 47 years old, she had built something in the world of money that almost no one who looked like her had ever been allowed to build, and that very few people of any kind ever built at all. She was the founder and managing principal of Meridian Sovereign Capital, a firm that did not advertise, did not chase headlines, and did not explain itself to anyone. Meridian managed money for the kind of clients who never appeared in magazines: public pension funds, university endowments, a sovereign wealth office or two on the far side of the world. The numbers attached to those relationships were large enough that saying them out loud in an ordinary room tended to change the temperature of the air. Ada had grown that firm from a single rented desk and a telephone into something that quietly moved markets. And she had done it in an industry that had spent her entire career assuming, every single time she walked through a glass door, that she must be lost. She had a particular talent that made her dangerous to comfortable men and invaluable to the boards who hired her. She could read an organization the way a doctor reads an X-ray, not the polished story it told about itself in its pitch decks and its mission statements, but the truth that lived underneath, in the small moments when nobody important was supposed to be watching. She believed, all the way down to the bone, that the real character of any company was never revealed in how it treated the people it was trying to impress. It was revealed in how it treated the people it had already decided did not matter. That belief was not academic for her. It had been carved into her, one cut at a time, across a lifetime of being the person a company had decided did not matter. Ada disliked the costume of wealth, the watches that cost more than houses, the bodyguards who followed men into rooms that held no danger, the constant low performance of importance that so many powerful people seemed to need just to feel real in front of strangers. She traveled alone. She carried her own bag. She booked her own appointments under her own name. And she showed up early. And she waited her turn like everyone else. Because the moment she stopped waiting her turn was the moment she would stop being able to see what a place was actually like for the people who had no choice but to wait. She carried only one object that mattered to her. And she carried it every single day. It was a pocket watch. Old. Scratched. The gold worn down at the edges to a softer color. the kind of object that looked like nothing at all to anyone who did not know what it was. It had belonged to her grandfather, Elias Sterling, who had spent 31 years of his life as a porter on the railroads, carrying other men's luggage, shining other men's shoes, answering to the word boy from passengers half his age who would never once trouble themselves to learn his name. He smiled at them, because smiling was the job. And the job was how his children ate. Elias had bought that watch with his own tips, $1 at a time, over the better part of a decade. It was the first thing he had ever owned that no white man had handed to him and could take back. He used to tell his granddaughter that a man could carry other people's bags his whole life and still walk through the world like he owned the ground under his feet, as long as he never once let another person's opinion of him become his own opinion of himself. He died when Ada was 19, in a small apartment with a leaking radiator, having never seen the inside of a building like the one she would walk into on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Decades later, the watch had stopped working years ago. She had never bothered to fix it. It did not need to keep time. It only needed to remind her what time it was. That particular Tuesday, the watch sat in the inside pocket of her coat, against her chest. As she stepped out of a taxi onto a wet sidewalk in the financial district and looked up at a building she had been thinking about. Quietly. For almost a year, the building belonged to Ashford Pemberton. If you did not work in money, the name would mean nothing to you. If you did, it meant a great deal. Most of it more than 100 years old. Ashford Pemberton was a private wealth firm founded in the year 1911. The kind of place with portraits of dead men on the walls and a client list that read like the index of an old history book. It managed the fortunes of families who had been rich for so many generations that they had forgotten how the money was originally made, and preferred not to be reminded, for most of a century, that pedigree had been enough. A name like Ashford Pemberton on the door had been a promise all by itself, and the promise had been kept by men who looked a very specific way and came from a very specific set of places. And the money had flowed in without anyone at the firm ever having to think very hard about why. But the world had changed, and the firm had not. And the gap between those two facts had been widening for years. The old families were dying off, dividing their fortunes among grandchildren who kept their money in index funds and phone apps and did not see the point of paying a man in a paneled office to do what a piece of software could do for almost nothing. The fees had thinned. The portraits on the walls had started to look less like heritage and more like a warning, and the firm that had spent 100 years never having to ask whether it deserved its clients was suddenly, for the first time, in the unfamiliar and frightening position of needing them. That was why Ada Sterling was standing on the sidewalk in the rain. For the past 11 months, Ashford Pemberton had been courting her firm with a persistence that bordered on desperation, though they would never have used that word. Meridian Sovereign was assembling something the entire industry had been whispering about: a new co-investment vehicle. A pool of institutional capital so large that the firms chosen to help manage and distribute it would have their futures secured for a generation. The mandate was worth $4 billion. More than that, it was worth survival. For a firm like Ashford Pemberton, bleeding old money and unable to attract anything new, winning a piece of that mandate was not a nice opportunity. It was oxygen, and the decision about who would be selected rested, in the end, with one single person. It rested with Ada. She had been to their offices once before, briefly, for an introductory meeting 8 months earlier. A polished affair full of confident men and expensive sandwiches, where everyone had said all the right things and meant almost none of them. Today was different. Today was the final stage, the meeting where she would sit across from the firm's leadership, look them in the eye, and make her decision in person. They knew she was coming. The chairman had cleared her schedule. The deal team had been preparing for weeks. There was a conference room reserved on the top floor, with her name on a small printed card, and a folder waiting on the table with the final terms, and a fountain pen that probably cost more than her grandfather had earned in an entire year. What they did not know, what almost no one ever knew, because it was the entire point, was how she intended to spend the first part of her visit. Ada had learned a long time ago that the most honest hour she would ever get inside a company was the hour before anyone in charge knew she had arrived. The pitch meeting would be a performance, every smile rehearsed, every answer focus grouped. She had sat through 1,000 of those performances and learned almost nothing from any of them. But the lobby, the front desk, the unguarded ground floor, where the firm believed it was only dealing with ordinary people, the lobby never lied. The lobby was where a firm forgot to perform, because the lobby was where it believed no one important was watching. So she had made a quiet decision, the kind she had made dozens of times before. In hotels and banks and waiting rooms across the world, she would arrive early, under her own name, but with no announcement, no entourage, nothing at all to signal who she was. She would sit in the waiting area, like any other person with an appointment, and she would watch how a firm that had spent 100 years deciding who belonged would decide what to do with a black woman in a good coat who had not yet told them she was the most important visitor they would receive that year, or possibly that decade. She did not expect what happened next, but she was not, in the end, surprised by it either. That was the part that always cost her something. Even after all these years, not the shock of being treated as less than she was, but the quiet, familiar ache of how completely unsurprising it remained. She pushed open the heavy glass door, stepped out of the rain and into the cathedral hush of the Ashford Pemberton lobby, and walked toward the front desk to check in for the most important meeting that building would host all year. A meeting that, by the time she left, would no longer be happening at all. The young woman behind the front desk was named Brooke Halloran, and she was very good at a particular kind of job that no one had ever written down. Officially, she managed reception and client arrivals. Unofficially, she had been hired and trained through 1,000 small corrections that nobody ever said out loud, to sort the people who walked through that door into 2 categories: the ones who belonged and the ones who did not, and to do it in the first 2 seconds, before a single word was exchanged. She was 28, sharp, ambitious, and she had learned that her own future at the firm depended on getting that sorting right, on never once letting the wrong kind of person waste a partner's time. She did not think of this as prejudice. She thought of it as standards. Almost nobody who does it ever thinks of it as anything else. Brooke looked up as Ada approached, and the sorting happened before Ada had said a word. The coat was good. Brooke could see that, but the woman wore no jewelry that announced money, carried no assistant, had no car waiting that anyone had called ahead about. She was black, and she was alone. And in the entire mental filing system Brooke had built across 3 years at that desk, there was no folder for a black woman who arrived alone and belonged on the top floor. So Brooke reached for the folder she did have, and arranged her face into the particular smile she reserved for people she expected to send away. "Can I help you find something?" she asked. Not, "Can I help you?" which is what she said to clients. "Can I help you find something?" which is what she said to people who were lost. "I have a 10 o'clock. Ada said. Sterling. Brooke's eyes flicked to her screen. Then, back up. And the smile held but cooled by a degree. And who is the appointment with? Mr. Ashford. And his team. There was a pause then. A small one. The kind most people would never notice. But Ada noticed everything. She watched the young woman's certainty wobble. Just slightly. Against the unexpected name. And then she watched the certainty win. Because certainty almost always wins when it has been rewarded for years. Brooke decided, in that half-second, that whatever this was, it was a mistake. A wrong name. A confused vendor. A person who had read the appointment wrong. Preston Ashford did not take 10 o'clock meetings with women who walked in off the street alone. That was simply not a thing that happened. And Brooke had built her whole understanding of the firm on the things that did and did not happen. I don't see you on his calendar, she said, which was not quite a lie, because she had not actually looked, and was not going to. Are you sure it wasn't with our client services group? They handle new accounts? I can have someone come down and get you set up. Do you already have an account with us? Or would this be opening a new relationship? Ada let the question sit for a moment. She could have ended it right there. She could have said the words that would have rearranged that young woman's entire morning. I am the principal of Meridian Sovereign Capital, and your chairman cleared his schedule for me 3 weeks ago. And if you do not find my name on that calendar in the next 30 seconds, you will spend the rest of your career explaining how you did not. She had said versions of that sentence before, in other lobbies, and watched the color drain out of other faces. It never felt as good as people imagined it would, and it always ended the experiment before she had learned what she came to learn. So instead, she said, simply, I'll wait. He is expecting me. Brooke gestured toward the seating area with the relief of a person who has successfully moved a problem 6 feet to the left. Of course. Have a seat, and I will see what I can do. Ada walked to the waiting area and sat down in a low leather chair near the door, set her bag beside her feet, and folded her hands in her lap. She did not take out her phone. She did not pretend to read. She simply sat, still and observant, the way her grandfather had taught her to sit in waiting rooms a long time ago. Present. Patient. Missing nothing. And she began, quietly, to take the firm's measure. The lobby of Ashford Pemberton was designed to make people feel small, and it was very good at its job. The ceilings rose 2 stories to a great expanse of dark, coffered wood. The floor was pale marble, veined with gray, polished to a mirror, so that the dead men in the wall portraits seemed to float above their own reflections. Everything in the room was expensive and old and quiet, and all of it said the same thing in 100 wordless ways. You are a guest here. We have been here longer than you, and we will be here after you are gone. Ada had sat in 100 rooms built to deliver that message, and she had long ago stopped letting it land. She knew something the room did not want her to know, which was that the marble and the portraits and the hush were not strength. They were a costume. They were what a place reached for when it was no longer sure of itself. Real strength, in her experience, rarely needed 2 stories of ceiling to make its point. Minutes passed. Then more minutes. Brooke made a phone call, spoke briefly, hung up, and did not look at Ada again. A delivery arrived and was handled. A pair of analysts crossed the lobby toward the elevators, laughing about something, and did not glance at the woman in the chair by the door. 10 minutes became 20. 20 became 40. Her 10 o'clock came and went. on the great brass clock above the reception desk, and no one came down to collect her. She did not fidget. She did not check her watch. Not the broken one against her chest, and not the time on her phone. She simply watched. And what she watched told her more about Ashford Pemberton than 100 pitch meetings ever could. She watched a young man named Daniel Okonkwo cross the lobby twice. Daniel was 24, a first-year analyst, and the only black face she had seen on that floor since she arrived. He had grown up 2 hours and several universes away from this building, raised by a mother who cleaned office towers very much like this one on the overnight shift, so that her son would one day get to walk through the front door of one instead of the service entrance. He had worked harder than almost anyone in his graduating class to earn a desk at a firm like this. And he had spent his first 8 months learning a second language nobody put in the handbook. The language of how to be the only one in the room, how to laugh at the jokes, how to make himself small and pleasant and unthreatening, how to never, ever be the black person who made the white people uncomfortable. Because he understood with total clarity that his job depended on it in a way that none of his colleagues' jobs depended on anything. Daniel noticed Ada the second time he crossed the lobby. He noticed her the way you notice a relative in a crowd, with a small jolt of recognition that has nothing to do with knowing the person's face. He saw a black woman sitting alone in a chair by the door at a firm where black women did not sit in chairs by the door. And some deep, exhausted part of him understood the whole situation before he had a single fact to support it. He saw the way Brooke was not looking at her. He saw how long she had been sitting there, and he felt, rising in his chest, the specific sick dread of a person who recognizes an injustice unfolding and knows, at the very same moment, exactly how much it would cost him to say something about it. He thought about walking over. He thought about asking her if she was being helped, if there was someone he could call, if she had been waiting long. The words were right there. And then he thought about his manager, and his probation period, and the careful, fragile thing he had spent 8 months building, and the way the partners talked about analysts who made things complicated. And he did the thing he had been trained by a lifetime to do. He looked at the floor. He kept walking. He told himself it was not his business, that he did not know the full story, that maybe she really was just a confused walk-in, and he would embarrass them both. He would replay that walk across the lobby in his head for a very long time afterward. He would remember exactly how the marble felt under his shoes, and exactly how she had been sitting, and exactly how easy it would have been to stop. It was a decision that would change the entire course of his life, though he had no way of knowing that yet. In that moment it felt like nothing at all. It felt like survival. That was the worst part. The part he would understand only later. The silence had not felt like cowardice from the inside. It had felt like sense. While Ada waited, the lobby gave her its clearest lesson of the morning, and it gave it to her for free. At around 20 minutes to 11, a couple swept through the glass doors, an older man and woman, silver-haired, beautifully dressed, the kind of people who move through the world as though the floor had been swept clean ahead of them, because it always had. This was Gordon and Eleanor Hartwell, third-generation clients, the great-grandchildren of money so old that the original sin of it had been laundered by time into something the family now called legacy. They did not check in at the front desk. They did not need to. Brooke was around the desk and across the lobby before they had finished shaking the rain off their coats. Her voice rising half an octave into a register Ada had not heard her use all morning. Mr. and Mrs. Hartwell, it is so wonderful to see you. Mr. Pemberton is expecting you. Let me take you right up. Can I get you anything, coffee? Water. Something while you settle in. And then came the detail that Ada would carry out of that building and into every conversation she had about it afterward. A partner appeared. Not summoned. Not paged. He simply materialized from the elevator bank, with a glass of sparkling water already in his hand. Beaming. Arms slightly open. The universal posture of a man greeting people, he has decided, are worth his time. The Hartwells were swept into a waiting elevator within 90 seconds of walking through the door. Laughing. Fussed over. Carried upward toward the same top floor, where Ada Sterling had an appointment. She had now been waiting nearly an hour past. Ada watched the elevator doors close on the Hartwells' easy laughter. And she sat with what she had just been shown. It was not subtle. It was not a matter of interpretation, or oversensitivity, or reading too much into things. The way people always told her it was. It was a controlled experiment with a clean result. Same firm, same lobby, same front desk, same morning. 2 arrivals. One was met with water before she had asked for it, and an escort before she had needed one. The other was being left in a chair by the door. The only variable that had changed was who was sitting in it. She was not angry. Exactly. Anger was a luxury. She had stopped being able to afford somewhere around her 2nd decade in this industry. Because anger was the trap. The moment she raised her voice, she became the angry black woman. And the story stopped being about what they had done and became a story about how she had reacted. She had watched that switch get flipped on too many other people to ever let anyone flip it on her. So she did not get angry. She got precise. She watched. And she remembered. And she let the firm keep showing her exactly who it was. Because every minute it spent showing her was a minute that made her decision easier. What she did not yet know, sitting in that chair, was that the morning was not going to be content to leave her there in dignified, instructive silence. The morning was about to come down the elevator and introduce itself. At 11 o'clock. A full hour past the time printed on her appointment. Preston Ashford came down to deal with the problem in his lobby. Preston was 58 years old. And he was the managing partner of Ashford Pemberton because his great-grandfather's name was on the building, which was a fact he had spent his entire life carefully reframing as merit. He had never once in his career walked into a room he had not been told in advance he belonged in. He had never been followed in a store. Never been pulled over for nothing. Never had a stranger decide who he was before he opened his mouth. He had no idea that any of this was unusual, because to him it was simply the texture of reality, the way water is to a fish. He had been told, vaguely, by a flustered brook, that there was a woman in the lobby insisting she had a meeting with him. A black woman. Alone. No appointment that anyone could find. Claiming a 10 o'clock, and Preston had assembled the entire explanation in the elevator ride down, before he had even laid eyes on her. Some confusion, some misunderstanding, probably some small account client who had inflated her own importance, or some person who simply assumed a firm like his was the kind of place she could walk into and be seen. He crossed the lobby toward her, and he did not extend his hand, and he did not lower his voice. He had decided, the instant he saw her, that whatever this was did not require privacy, because she did not require it. Look at this dark skin sitting here, trying to look important, he said, and he let out a short, dry laugh, pitched to Carrie. A laugh that was performed for the room and not for her. Let me save us both some time. Sweetheart, a high-end firm like ours does not do walk-ins for people like you. And then he did the thing that the whole lobby would remember. He reached over the front desk, took a glossy brochure off the stack, the cheap one, printed for retail inquiries. And he dropped it into her lap from a height. The small, contemptuous toss of a man feeding a stray. Go try the community branch, 2 blocks south. Our investment minimums are out of reach for your kind. And frankly, you are ruining the view for our actual, wealthy clients. The lobby went dead silent. Brooke had stopped pretending to work. 2 analysts by the elevator had stopped pretending not to listen. And Daniel Okonkwo, standing near the corridor with a stack of binders pressed against his chest, had gone completely still, and the blood had drained out of his face, because he understood every single layer of what was happening in a way that Preston Ashford was constitutionally incapable of understanding it. He heard people like you. He heard your kind. He heard ruining the view. And he watched a brochure land in a woman's lap, like a thing thrown to the ground. And he felt the old, familiar humiliation light up in his own body as though it were being done to him. Because in every way that mattered, it was, and still, this was the part Daniel would have to live with. He said nothing. He looked down at the binders in his arms. He turned, slowly, and walked back down the corridor. And the sound of his own footsteps on the marble was the loudest thing he had ever heard. Ada did not flinch. She did not brush the brochure off her lap in disgust. And she did not pick it up. She let it lie exactly where he had thrown it, because she had decided that she was not going to give him the small satisfaction of a reaction, and because she wanted it sitting there, visible, while she did what she had come to do, which was to look at him. She had reached Binau, the still center she went to in moments like this, a place her grandfather had built in her without ever naming it, a place from which she could watch a man humiliate her and feel something almost like pity for how little he understood about what he was doing. She looked at Preston Ashford, and she saw exactly what he was, and exactly what he was not. He believed he had power in this lobby. He had a name on a building and 100 years of marble behind him. And he had never once been made to find out that the two were not the same thing. He thought the costume was the body. He thought the portraits were ancestors instead of warnings. And he had looked at a woman who could buy and sell his entire firm 10 times over before lunch. And he had seen a stray to be shooed away from the glass. She let the silence stretch just long enough to make him aware of it. Then she reached down, picked up her bag, and rose from the chair in one smooth, unhurried motion. And even Preston, who understood almost nothing, understood that something in the room had shifted. Though he could not have said what. "Thank you, Mr. Ashford," she said. Her voice was perfectly level. "You have been very clear." She did not raise her voice. She did not list her credentials. She did not say a single one of the things that would have ended his certainty and replaced it with terror. And she knew them all. Every fact that would have turned his face gray. And she chose, deliberately, not to use any of them yet, because she had learned something over the years that she could never quite explain to people who had not lived it. That the most powerful thing she could do in that lobby was not to win the argument. It was to deny him the argument entirely, to leave with the truth still folded up in her coat, unspent, hairs, to let him keep believing, for a few more minutes, that he had handled the situation, so that the floor would be that much farther to fall when it finally gave way beneath him. She turned toward the door. And then she stopped, and turned back, and asked him one quiet question, in a voice so calm that the people listening would remember it long after they had forgotten everything else about that morning. "Before I go," she said, "I would like to understand one thing. so that I have it right. In the hour I've been sitting in that chair, a couple walked in behind me and were upstairs in 90 seconds with sparkling water in their hands. I would just like to know, honestly, and you do not have to answer me, what was different about them? Was it the appointment, because I had one too? Or was it something else? I am asking because I think the answer matters far more than you know. Preston Ashford opened his mouth, and for the first time in a very long time, he found that he had nothing to say. The honest answer was sitting right there at the front of his mind, fully formed, and it was a sentence he could not possibly say out loud. Not in that lobby, not in front of his analysts, not to himself. They looked like they belonged here. You do not. He felt the shape of it, and he felt the heat climb up his neck, and he reached for the easy deflection. Every client's situation is different, but it died in his throat under the steadiness of her gaze. Because they both knew it was a lie, and she had built the question so carefully that the lie would be the answer. I didn't think so, Ada said quietly, into his silence. Thank you for your time. And she walked out of the Ashford Pemberton lobby, into the gray morning, her steps unhurried, her grandfather's broken watch against her chest, leaving behind a managing partner who believed, for perhaps 4 more minutes, that he had won. 22 floors above the lobby, in a glass-walled conference room with a view of the entire harbor, the most important meeting in the history of Ashford Pemberton was quietly falling apart. And nobody in the room yet understood why. Around the long table sat the firm's leadership, the institutional desk, the senior partners, the analysts who had spent 3 weeks building the models. At the head of the table sat Eleanor Vance, the firm's chairman, 63 years old, the first woman to hold that title in the firm's history, and a person who had clawed every inch of her own way up through this institution and therefore understood, far better than Preston ever would, exactly how fragile the whole thing had become. On the table in front of her was a leather folder containing the final terms of the partnership with Meridian Sovereign Capital. The deal that, if signed, would secure the firm's future for a generation, and if lost, would very likely begin its end. They'd been ready since 9 that morning. The coffee had gone cold and been replaced twice. Where is she? Eleanor asked, for the 3rd time, checking the slim gold watch on her wrist. Sterling was confirmed for 10. It is nearly 11:15. A junior associate named Christopher had been sent twice to check with reception, and had come back both times, confused. They do not have her checked in downstairs, he said. I asked Brooke directly. She says, no one by that name has come through for the executive floor. Eleanor frowned. Adaura, Sterling did not strike her from their previous meeting as a person who was late, or who failed to show, or who played games. Eleanor had spent the better part of a year on this. She had read everything there was to read about Sterling. The firm she had built from nothing, the returns that made the rest of the industry quietly furious, the reputation she had for a kind of unsentimental clarity that was either the most refreshing or the most terrifying thing about her, depending on which side of her you happened to be on. Eleanor had staked her own chairmanship on landing this mandate. The idea that Sterling had simply not appeared made no sense at all. Call her office, Eleanor said. Now. Christopher stepped out, and the room waited, the small talk dying, the models suddenly looking like a great deal of work that might have been for nothing. When the associate came back in 2 minutes later, his face had changed in a way that made everyone at the table sit up before he had said a word. I spoke to her chief of staff, he said, and his voice was strange, Careful. The voice of a person trying to deliver information. He does not want to be the one delivering. Miss Sterling is not coming up. She has already left the building. Left, Eleanor said. Left for where? Was there an emergency? No. Mom. Christopher swallowed. Her chief of staff said that Miss Sterling arrived this morning a little before 10. On time. Under her own name. And that she always does her final site visits this way. She comes early, without telling anyone. And she sits in the lobby for an hour before the meeting. On purpose, to see how the firm treats people when it does not know who she is. He looked up. She said it is the most important part of Miss Sterling's diligence, she said. And I am quoting her exactly. That Miss Sterling has always believed you cannot trust a firm with your beneficiary's money until you have watched how it treats someone it thinks can do nothing for it. The silence in that room was total. Eleanor Vance felt something cold move through her chest. Because she had been in this business for 40 years. And she understood, instantly and completely, what those words meant. She understood that the single most important client the firm had courted in a decade had been sitting in their own lobby for an hour. Watching. Evaluating. Taking the firm's measure in the one place the firm never bothered to guard, and that whatever had happened down there, whatever Sterling had seen, had been enough to make her stand up and walk out before the meeting had even begun. What happened in the lobby? Eleanor said, very quietly. It was not a question. The answer arrived in the form of Preston Ashford, who chose that exact moment to stride into the conference room with the relaxed satisfaction of a man returning from handling a minor nuisance, entirely unaware that he was walking into the wreckage of his own life. Sorry I'm late, he said breezily. Taking his seat. Had to deal with a situation downstairs. Some woman in the lobby insisting she had a meeting up here. No appointment. Nothing in the book. You know the type. I sent her on her way. He reached for the cold coffee. So, is Sterling here? Yet I am dying to finally meet this woman. Everyone is so terrified of. Nobody at the table moved. Nobody breathed. Eleanor Vance looked at Preston Ashford the way you look at a man who has just told you, cheerfully, that he set fire to something while you were out, not yet realizing it was the house. And then, in a voice so calm, it was almost gentle, she asked him the only question that mattered. Preston, the woman in the lobby, what was her name? He waved a hand. I don't know. Sterling. Something. That is probably what caused the confusion downstairs. She was using the same name. He stopped. He stopped because he watched the blood leave the face of every person at that table at exactly the same time. And because some animal part of his brain, the part that had never once in 58 years had to be afraid of anything, registered the danger, a full second before the front of his mind caught up. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at the leather folder in front of her, with the Meridian Sovereign name embossed on the cover. He looked back at Eleanor's face. And he watched her close her eyes for a moment. The way a person does when a catastrophe becomes too large to look at directly. No. Preston said. No. That is not. She was a walk-in. She did not have an appointment. She was alone. There was no car. She looked. His voice climbed. She looked like what? Preston, Eleanor said. And now her eyes were open. And there was something terrible in them. Finish the sentence. She looked like what? He could not finish the sentence. For the second time in 20 minutes, Preston Ashford found that the honest answer was a thing he could not say out loud. She looked like she did not belong. The words were right there. And they were the whole truth of what he had done. and as he stood at the very edge of saying them, he finally understood, all at once, with the force of a building collapsing, exactly what he had been looking at when he looked at her, and exactly what it had cost. He had taken the most powerful asset allocator the firm had ever been in a room with, a woman who personally controlled the single deal that would decide whether Ashford Pemberton survived the decade. And he had told her to try the community branch 2 blocks south. He had thrown a brochure into her lap. He had called her dark skin out loud, in his own lobby, in front of his own analysts, and told her she was ruining the view. And he had done it for one reason, and one reason only, a reason he had spent his entire comfortable life never once having to examine, because no one had ever forced him to. Eleanor Vance was already on her feet. "Get her on the phone," she said to Christopher. "Get her chief of staff. Get whoever. I do not care. Tell them the chairman is asking, begging, for 10 minutes. She was moving toward the door. "Everyone downstairs. Now, if she has not left the block yet, we are going to be standing in that lobby when she turns around. Every single partner in this firm." She stopped, and for a moment the polished chairman vanished, and only the woman who had fought her whole life to build something was left standing there. God help us. "Move." What followed was a thing the analysts who witnessed it would describe in hushed voices for years afterward, at other firms, in other cities. The way people describe disasters, they survived. The leadership of a 114-year-old institution came down 22 floors in a state of barely controlled panic. The elevators could not move fast enough. Partners who had not personally pressed a lobby button in 2 decades crowded into the brass cars in their $1,000 suits, straightening their ties, rehearsing apologies, and spilled out into the marble lobby in a wave, and stopped because she was gone. The chair by the door was empty. The cheap brochure lay on the floor where it had fallen. Brooke Halloran stood frozen behind the desk. Beginning, from the looks on the partners' faces, to understand the magnitude of what had happened on her watch. The morning rearranging itself in her memory into something monstrous. The lobby was just a lobby. The rain ran down the great glass doors, and on the low leather chair where Adiora Sterling had sat for an hour, absorbing everything that firm was, there was nothing at all, except a single business card she had placed there. Face up. On her way out, a plain white card. Heavy stock. No logo. Just a name and a private line. Left exactly where they would be sure to find it. Adiora Sterling. Principal. Meridian Sovereign Capital. Eleanor Vance picked it up off the chair and held it. And, for a long moment, the chairman of Ashford Pemberton simply stood in the center of her own marble lobby, under the portraits of all the dead men who had built the place to keep people like Ada Sterling outside of it, and understood that the firm had finally, fatally, succeeded. Ada Sterling took the chairman's call from the back of a taxi 6 blocks away, watching the rain beat and run on the window, the white card's twin still in her coat pocket. She let it ring 3 times before she answered. Not for drama, but because she wanted to be sure of her own voice first. When she did answer, Eleanor Vance was already most of the way through an apology, and Ada listened to all of it without interrupting. The way she listened to everything, completely, patiently, missing nothing. It was, she could tell, a real apology, which was rarer than people thought. Eleanor did not say, "I am sorry you feel that way." She did not say there has been a terrible misunderstanding, as though the problem were a clerical error and not a man's heart. She said, plainly, that what had happened in that lobby was a disgrace, that it was the firm's disgrace and not Ada's misfortune, and that she, Eleanor, would understand completely if Ada never wanted to hear the name Ashford Pemberton again as long as she lived. And then she asked, with a humility that clearly cost her something, for one meeting, not to rescue the deal, to look Ada in the eye and own it, "You do not owe us that." Eleanor said, "I am aware. I am asking anyway." Ada was quiet for a moment, watching the city slide past. "I will give you 30 minutes, she said finally. "Not at your offices. And Mr. Ashford will be there. I want to ask him something, and I want him to have to answer it in a room he cannot send me out of." They met 2 days later, in a neutral conference room, in a building that belonged to neither of them. And the geometry of the thing had completely reversed. Now it was Ada who arrived exactly on time and was shown in immediately. Now it was the partnership of Ashford Pemberton who had been kept waiting, who rose when she entered, who had no idea what was coming. Eleanor Vance sat across from her, and beside Eleanor, gray and diminished, and looking somehow smaller than he had in the lobby, sat Preston Ashford, a man who had spent 2 days in the particular hell of replaying every word he had said to her, and understanding it anew each time. He apologized first, and his apology was everything Eleanor's had not been. It was clumsy and frantic and shaped entirely by panic. The apology of a man who was sorry for what had happened to him, dressed up as an apology for what he had done to her. He talked about the pressure of the day, the confusion at the desk, his deep and lifelong commitment to treating everyone with respect. He said he hoped she could understand that it was an honest mistake, that anyone might have been confused, that it had nothing whatsoever to do with. And here he could not even say the word, and the not saying of it hung in the air like smoke. Ada let him finish. Then she asked him the question she had driven across the city to ask. "Mr. Ashford," she said, "I want you to answer me honestly, because I think you are capable of it. And I think you have spent the last 2 days closer to honest than you have been in years. When I walked into your lobby on Tuesday, same coat, same name, same appointment. If my skin had been a different color, would I have spent 1 single minute in that chair?" The room went very still. Preston Ashford opened his mouth. And then, to his credit, and it was, in the end, very nearly the only thing to his credit in the entire affair, he did not reach for the lie. He had reached for it twice already, in the lobby and in the conference room, and both times it had died in his throat. And somewhere in the last 2 days, he had apparently grown tired of the taste of it. He looked at her, and his eyes were wet. And for the first time, he looked less like a managing partner and more like a man finding out something about himself that he was going to have to carry for the rest of his life. "No," he said. The word came out cracked. "No, you would not have. You would have been upstairs in 90 seconds with a glass of water in your hand." He pressed his lips together. "I keep trying to find a version of it that is not that. I have been trying for 2 days. There is not one. I looked at you, and I decided who you were. And I never asked you a single question. And the only reason I decided what I decided was what you look like. That is all it was. That is the whole of it. I told a woman who could buy my whole firm that she was ruining the view." He shut his eyes. "I am going to hear myself say that for the rest of my life." Ada nodded slowly. She did not gloat. She did not tell him he was forgiven, because he was not really asking her for forgiveness. and she was not in the business of dispensing it to make powerful men feel lighter. "Thank you for that," she said quietly. "I mean it. That is the first true thing anyone at your firm has said to me. And I know what it cost you." She folded her hands on the table. "But I need you to understand what you actually showed me. Because it is bigger than your mourning. And it is bigger than me. You run a firm that asks families to trust you with the thing they care about most, the future of their children, the security of everything they ever built, and the way a firm treats a stranger it believes is powerless is the truest possible test of whether that trust is earned. Because that is the one moment when no one is performing. That is the moment the real culture shows. I did not sit in your lobby for an hour to be insulted. Mr. Ashford, I sat there because that hour was the only honest meeting I was ever going to get. And it told me everything I needed to know." She turned to Eleanor Vance. "I am withdrawing Meridian from the partnership," she said. "I want you to hear the reason directly from me, so that it is not softened by a lawyer's letter. It is not revenge. I do not do revenge. It is expensive, and it does not compound. This is diligence. I cannot in good conscience place my beneficiary's capital with a firm whose leadership, given a stranger and no information, defaults to contempt, not because of how it made me feel, because of what it predicts. A firm that cannot see a person clearly, cannot see a risk clearly either. The same blindness that put me in that chair is the blindness that buries the bad number in the footnote and the bad behavior in the file. I have watched it 100 times. It always costs the people who can least afford it. And it always, eventually, comes due. The withdrawal was the single largest blow Ashford Pemberton had absorbed in its history. And it did not stay private. Because nothing in that world ever did. Within a week, the trade press had the story. And then it had the better story underneath the story. The reason, the detail that traveled, the detail that lit up every desk in the industry and every dinner table in the city, was not the size of the lost mandate. Though it was enormous, it was the image, a 114-year-old firm, a black woman in a good coat, an hour in a chair by the door, a brochure thrown into her lap. Try the community branch 2 blocks south. It was a story that needed no explanation, because some version of it lived in the memory of nearly everyone who had ever been made to wait, while someone who looked the right way was waved straight through. And once the light was on the firm, the light found the rest of it, the way light always does. A former analyst, a young black woman who had left Ashford Pemberton 2 years earlier, convinced she had imagined the slow suffocation of being the only one, came forward with the careful record she had kept, and never thought anyone would believe. Then another former employee, then a pattern that the firm's own files confirmed. Once anyone bothered to actually read them, a long, quiet history of minority-led fund managers who were given meetings and then somehow never given mandates, of clients of color who were routed to the entry-level products and never told the firm did anything else, of complaints that had been received and soothed and filed and forgotten by managers who found it easier to make the discomfort go away than to ask what was causing it. None of it had ever been a scandal, because none of it had ever cost the firm $1. It had simply been the water the fish swam in. Now the water had been drained, and everyone could see, lying on the bottom, exactly what had always been there. Preston Ashford resigned as managing partner within the month. He did not go in handcuffs, because what he had done was not a crime. And that was, in a way, the most uncomfortable truth the whole affair left behind. He had broken no law. He had simply done out loud, and to the wrong person. The thing that 1,000 men in 1,000 lobbies do quietly every single day to people who have no card to leave on the chair. His name came down off the masthead. His great-grandfather's name stayed on the building, which Preston found, in the long nights that followed, to be its own particular punishment. A name he had spent his whole life believing was a birthright. Now a thing he had to walk past every morning and remember what he had nearly destroyed with it. To his credit, and against the advice of nearly everyone around him, he did not vanish quietly into a comfortable retirement and let the firm bury the story. Eleanor Vance had asked one thing of him before he left, and he had agreed to it. She asked him to sit in person through the first session of what the firm built in the wreckage, not as a leader, not as an example, but as a man in a chair who had to listen. He went. He said almost nothing, but people noticed that he stayed afterward, alone, looking for a long time at a single photograph that had been placed at the front of the room. A photograph of an empty leather chair beside a glass door, a cheap brochure lying on the floor, and a plain white business card sitting on the seat. Face up, because Eleanor Vance did not do what most firms do, which is to settle quietly, issue a statement about valuing diversity, and wait for the news cycle to move on. Eleanor had spent 40 years as the only woman in rooms full of men like Preston, and she understood in her bones that a culture which produces one lobby will produce 1,000 more, unless someone reaches all the way down to the thing that made it. She was not interested in saving the firm's reputation. She had decided, somewhere in those first terrible days, to try to save its soul instead, on the theory that the reputation might follow, and that even if it did not, the soul was the part worth saving. She called Ada. She did not ask her to come back. She had more sense than that, and more pride. What she asked for was harder and stranger. She asked Ada to help her build something that would make sure it never happened again. Not just at Ashford Pemberton, but if Ada was willing to use the platform, the whole industry was now watching. Anywhere. And Ada, who did not do revenge, because revenge did not compound, said yes to that. Because building something did. What they built together over the following year reshaped a corner of the financial world in a way that no diversity seminar ever had, for a reason that was almost brutally simple. It spoke the only language the industry had ever truly understood, which was money. The idea was Ada's, and it grew directly out of the hour she had spent in that chair. She called it a dignity audit. Though the name mattered less than the mechanism, the logic was this: the great asset owners of the world, the pension funds, the endowments, the sovereign offices, the institutions that decided where trillions of dollars went and which firms lived or died on those decisions, had always evaluated their managers on returns, on process, on compliance, on the polished performance of a pitch meeting. They had never evaluated the one thing that predicted everything else, which was how a firm behaved when it believed no one important was in the room. Ada had been measuring exactly that, by herself, her entire career. In lobbies and waiting rooms across the world, now she proposed to make it a standard. She proposed that before any institution placed its beneficiaries' money with any firm, it should require what she had always done quietly: an unannounced look at how that firm treated the people it had no reason at all to impress. It sounded soft to the men who first heard it, until they understood what it actually meant. It meant that contempt was no longer free. It meant that a firm could no longer leave a black woman in a chair for an hour and lose nothing, because now the chair was wired to the mandate. and the mandate was wired to survival. It meant that the cost of bias, which had always been paid by the people on the receiving end of it, would finally land on the people doing it. Ada did not have to argue that discrimination was wrong. She had stopped wasting her breath on that argument decades ago. She simply made it expensive. And the industry, which had never once moved an inch for the sake of what was right, moved a great deal for the sake of what was costly. Other allocators adopted it, first quietly, then openly, because the firms that adopted it found something the cynics had not predicted. The dignity audit was also, it turned out, an extraordinary predictor of returns. A firm that saw people clearly tended to see risk clearly. A firm that buried a person's worth in an assumption tended to bury a portfolio's risk in a footnote. The same blindness, every single time. Ada had been right about that in the conference room. And now there were numbers to prove it. And in that world, numbers were the only scripture anyone actually believed. Ashford Pemberton itself, under Eleanor, became the unlikely flagship of the very thing that had nearly killed it. The firm rebuilt its entire approach to who walked through the door. Not with a poster, but with structure, with accountability that had teeth, with a hard rule that every person who entered that lobby was a client until proven otherwise. The exact reverse of the rule that had governed it for 100 years. The portraits of the dead men came down off the walls of the main lobby, quietly, and were moved to a hallway upstairs. And in their place, Eleanor hung nothing at all, because she had come to believe the empty wall said something the portraits never could, and the front desk changed too. Though not in the way anyone expected. Brooke Halloran was not fired. Eleanor had thought hard about that, and had decided, in the end, that firing the 28-year-old who had been trained by the firm to do exactly what the firm wanted, and then making her the scapegoat for it, would be its own kind of cowardice, a way of locating the whole problem in the lowest paid person in the building, so that no one higher up had to look in the mirror. Brooke stayed, but Brooke had been in that lobby. She had seen the partners come down the stairs in a wave of panic. She had stood behind her desk and watched the morning rearrange itself into something she would never be able to unsee. She had spent 3 years believing she was upholding standards. And she had learned, in the space of 90 minutes, exactly what those standards had actually been. She did not need to be told. She became, over the following years, something close to fierce about it. The person on that floor most likely to walk a stranger to a chair and ask, by name, whether anyone had offered them anything yet. It is a particular kind of conversion. The kind that comes not from being punished, but from being forced to see. It does not always take. When it does, it tends to hold, but of everyone that morning touched, the one whose life it bent most sharply was the young man who had crossed the lobby twice and said nothing. Daniel Okonkwo had carried the silence of that morning like a stone in his chest for weeks. He had watched a woman who looked like his mother, like his aunts, like himself, to be told to find the community branch 2 blocks south. He had watched a brochure land in her lap like garbage, and he had looked at the floor and kept walking. And then he had watched the entire firm come apart over it, and had understood that the woman in the chair had been, all along, the most powerful person in the building. The lesson was not subtle, and it did not let him sleep. He kept arriving at the same unbearable place. He had recognized the injustice in real time, completely, in his own body, and he had stayed quiet anyway, because staying quiet had felt like survival. And he was no longer sure that survival was worth what it had cost. So, when the firm's internal reckoning came, and the lawyers and the consultants started taking their careful statements, and everyone with seniority started shaping the story into something that protected them. Daniel did the thing that 24-year-old analysts on probation are never, ever supposed to do. He told the truth. He told them exactly what he had seen and heard in that lobby. Every layer of it, including the words, "people like you and your kind," including the brochure, including his own silence, which he refused to leave out, even though leaving it out would have made him look better. He named it plainly. He knew it might cost him the job he had bled to get. The job his mother had cleaned floors at 3 a.m, so that he could one day have. He did it anyway. He had decided, somewhere in those sleepless weeks, that he would rather lose the desk than become the kind of man who keeps his desk by looking at the floor. It did not cost him the job. In the new world Eleanor was building, it was the single thing that most marked him as the future of the firm, rather than its past. But that is not the part of the story that matters. The part that matters is what happened a few months later, when Ada Sterling, who heard, eventually, because people like Ada always hear eventually, that there had been one young analyst on that floor who had finally stood up and told the whole truth at real risk to himself, picked up the phone and called him. She did not offer him a job. She had too much respect for him to collect him like a trophy. She offered him something rarer. She offered to be the person in his corner that no one had been in hers. When she was 24 and the only one in the room, she told him a story about a man who had spent 31 years carrying other people's bags and had walked through the world like he owned the ground anyway. About a watch that had stopped working a long time ago and had never once needed fixing. And she told him the thing her grandfather had told her. The thing she had spent a lifetime learning was true, that the silence had felt like survival from the inside, that it always does, and that the whole work of a life is learning to tell the difference between surviving and disappearing. Daniel Okonkwo would carry that conversation for the rest of his career, the way Ada carried the watch, and somewhere down the line, years from then, he would be the senior person on a floor, and a stranger would walk in and be made to wait. And he would not look at the floor. He would walk over, because that is how it actually moves. When it moves at all, not in a single thunderclap of justice, but one person at a time, one lobby at a time, one decision to walk over instead of walk past. Here is the part of the story that should not comfort you, though, because Ada herself would never let it. She won. That much is true. But she won because she had a $4 billion mandate folded up in her coat. And the firm could be made to bleed for what it did to her precisely because of who she turned out to be. The card on the chair was a kind of magic that almost no one possesses. And every single day, in 1,000 lobbies that no reporter will ever write about, the same scene plays out for people who have no card to leave behind. The black woman who is not a billionaire allocator, but a teacher, a nurse, a grandmother, who is left in the chair, who is routed to the brochure rack, who is told to try somewhere else. She walks out too, and nothing happens. No partners come down the stairs in a panic. No firm comes apart. No one calls to apologize. She just absorbs it. One more time. The way she has absorbed it her whole life. And the people who did it to her never feel a thing. And go home. And sleep just fine. That is the real story. Ada knew it. And she never once let an audience clap for her without saying it out loud. The lesson of that lobby was never that a powerful black woman got her revenge. It was that respect should never have required her to be powerful in the first place. The entire point. The thing she built, the dignity audit to chase. The thing she told every executive who called her, asking how to fix their own firm, was a world in which the stranger in the chair gets the glass of water before anyone asks who she is. Because the asking was always the disease. We decide a person is worthy only once we discover what they can do for us. The whole moral weight of her grandfather's watch was that a man's worth was never up for that kind of discovery. It was simply, always, already there, in the chair by the door. Whether anyone bothered to look up or not, years later, long after the headlines had faded and the trade press had moved on to other scandals, people in that industry still told the story of the morning. A black woman was left in a lobby for 2 hours and brought a 114-year-old firm to its knees by simply standing up and walking out. Most of them no longer remembered the managing partner's name. What they remembered was the card on the chair, and the question she had asked him in a room he could not send her out of, and the impossible, unbearable calm of a woman who answered open contempt, not with rage, but with the quiet, devastating refusal to be made smaller than she was. And if you have ever sat in that chair, if you have ever walked into a room and watched someone decide who you were before you opened your mouth, if you have ever been routed to the brochure rack, ever felt that old, familiar silence settle over a place the moment you entered it, then you already know this story. Because in some lobby, on some gray morning, it was yours. So tell us about it. Tell us, in the comments, about the moment you were underestimated, and what you did, and what you wish you had done. Tell us about the time you were the person in the chair, or the harder, more honest story, the time you were the one who walked past and looked at the floor, and what it taught you. If this story moved you, take 1 second to like it, and subscribe, and stay with us. Because the only thing that has ever moved this, the only thing that ever will, is people refusing to stay quiet about it. One comment, one story, one chair, one person at a time. Her grandfather carried other men's bags for 31 years, and never once let a single one of them tell him who he was. His granddaughter walked into a building that was built to keep her out, sat down in the chair by the door, and waited, not because she had to, but because she already knew that the truest thing about that firm would be written in how it treated her before it knew her name. They wrote it. She read it. And then she stood up, and the whole room rose with her. Because some kinds of dignity, once a person finally sees them, simply cannot be unseen. The watch in her coat still does not keep time. It never needed to. It only ever needed to remind her what time it was. And the time, she would tell you, is always now. It is always the moment in front of you. The stranger in the chair, the choice to look up, that is the only test that has ever mattered. Everyone in that lobby took it. And the only question the story leaves you with is the one it leaves all of us with. The one Ada built an entire second career around refusing to stop asking. When it is your turn, when the stranger walks in, and no one important is watching, and it would cost you nothing to look up, and nothing to stay silent. Which way will you look?